Welcome, everybody. As you are entering our webinar, we're so pleased to have you here with us today. I want to give the official welcome from all of us at Reed Washington. We are so glad you're here. If you are aware of our organization, because you signed up for this webinar, I hope you know something about us. We are a small nonprofit located in Seattle, Washington. We came together to do exactly what we're doing today, provide professional development opportunities, always based on the evidence being obtained from this growing body of information, the science of reading, with the purpose that every student becomes a skilled and confident reader. We know that working together, we can prevent the unnecessary pain of reading failure. And we're so glad you're part of our mission and here with us today. This is our founding board. We have with us today in the background, and you can wave, Julie and Amy, Julie Bedell and Amy Fleischer, currently working in the schools with children in a literacy capacity. Another board member not with us here today, Frank Greif. And myself, Jan Hasbrook, and we're just so pleased that you're joining us. We're able to bring this webinar to you today because of the generosity of two different sponsors. Step by Step Learning, longtime friends of Reed Washington, have provided us access to the webinar link that we're using today. And Pati Montgomery and her colleague Taylor Lutz are here today because of the generosity of their company, Schools Cubed. And I assume you're going to hear a little bit more about the great work that they do. A little bit of housekeeping. By around, well, maybe a little earlier, 10:10 or so, we'll officially turn this entirely over to Pati for about an hour and a half or so. Because of the nature of the webinar, we're going to leave the chat for all of you to chat with each other and respond and react. But if you have a question for us or for Pati, particularly, please put that in the Q&A. This is a little bit different format than you might be used to on Zoom because we are officially in a webinar format. We have some things to share with you today. There will be in the chat, and Amy may have already put some things in there. There will be a certificate of attendance and some links to handouts for Pati's presentation. That will be loaded a few times into chat. There will be slides. Pati's going to share slides from her presentation as a PDF, and that will be sent out to you with the recording within a few days. We really work hard to get that to you within at least 10 days, but it may even come sooner. And if you know folks who registered but were not able to attend today, they will be sent the recording automatically along with the handouts and the certificate of attendance.
Jan, can I pop in really quick?
Please.
Quickly. So we right now at this point don't have access to the chat, but we will in a few minutes. So the link that Jan's referring to that has the handouts and the certificate of attendance is not posted in the chat yet, but it will be soon. So okay. We'll make sure that it's there.
For sure. Yeah, there's another button I need to click, obviously. So I'll get that done as soon as I stop talking. Yeah. Thank you, Amy, for letting me know that. And let's see, where are we now in this process? We have a frozen screen is what we've got. Here's our speaker today. I know I'm very excited. Pati is bringing to us an unbelievable wealth of information. She has been out in the field, working hard in real world settings, doing a whole lot of stuff. She brings to us her experience as both a teacher and an administrator. Much of her work has been done with underserved populations. She's also been a special education administrator, and she took on a leadership role in the state of Colorado and worked as the executive director of literacy responsible for the implementation of a piece of legislation that has been copied and emulated by many other states. It was an amazing accomplishment. I had some opportunity to work with Patti during that time. It was terrific. She's now focusing her effort with a team of folks, including Taylor, who's here with us today. She works with her team as educational consultants, and they specialize in a hugely important, and you know that it's important because you're here today or you're going to be watching this webinar. You know how important it is if we are in fact going to meet the goal of every student being a successful reader and writer. We need leadership to support this, and that's what Patti and her team does at Schools Cube. They support principals and school leaders, help them get connected with the evidence around literacy and the evidence around best practice in leadership. Patti's written a few things, but one of the main important ones that many of you will probably want to get your hands on, if you haven't already, is her book, The Principal's Primer for Raising Reading Achievement. Again, that's just the essence of Patti, linking the best knowledge about literacy with implementation for leaders. So that's it. I'm excited. I've been excited to hear this for a long time. The science of school leadership, the research, and instructional implications. So I'm going to stop sharing, turn it over to Patti, get the chat ready for all of us to engage with.
Okay.
Should be ready. Well, okay, Patti, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. Before we get going, I want to make sure that I've introduced Taylor. Taylor is our executive director at Schools Cubed, and every single person on our team is an educator. Taylor is a former first grade teacher who now does lots of our background work. So Taylor, thank you for working with me this morning on a Saturday morning. I appreciate it. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen, and we will get started. Okay, has everybody got it? As Jan said, we may be reading specialists and not so much technical.
We got it, Patti.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's get going. So here's what I'd like to know. As Jan talked about the research on school leadership, I'd like to know in the chat box, but now I'm wondering, can they do it in the chat box or?
Yeah, chat is now available to everybody.
Okay, so the science of leadership. How many of you knew that there was a fairly large body of research on what effective principals do? Type in the chat box, please. I'd love to see your thinking.
You're getting a variety of answers there, Patti. We have some people, yes, or I knew there was some, or I have no idea, not sure. Leadership is key, that's for sure. So a mixture, yes and no.
Okay, well, good to know. We are actually, there is a large body of research. It's a synthesis of research of over 20 years of research. We're going to dig into that a little bit today, and we're really going to focus on one part of it. But the research is from the Wallace Foundation, and this was released in February of 2021. If you haven't read it, there's actually 3 large reports that go along with it. This was the first one to come out. And then 2 others came out in May of 2021. This one says specifically what it is that principals need to be doing in order to raise achievement for students in their schools. And then there is some research on what it is that they should be learning, and another body of research on what it is that they are learning in principal prep school. All absolutely fascinating reads. And again, I really urge you, if you are a school leader, particularly a district leader, to get your hands on that research. here's what we're going to be doing this morning. We're going to be looking at that research. As I said, we're going to take a high-level look at it. And we're going to dive into a little bit about, well, what's the problem? Not necessarily in the research, but what's the problem as far as implementing the research? Why might that be a little problematic for some people? We're going to talk about teacher evaluation.
Patty, this is Jan, and I think we're getting the shaky audio again. If you can turn on, yeah, I think that'll take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. We are going to dig into the teacher evaluation and observation, what needs to be done through that. We're going to provide you with some tips for evaluation, and we're going to talk about instructional feedback and coaching, and then establishing a data-driven instructional program, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. And as you're thinking about something, if you need to have something answered, go ahead and put it in the chat box. Okay, so here's what I think. Here's my own personal findings from working in hundreds of schools and dialoguing with thousands of principals each year. I think I actually think many, are a bit intimidated over providing feedback to teachers when it comes to literacy, particularly the science of reading. So here's what I'd like to know. Why might principals hesitate to provide instructional feedback to teachers in the area of reading? What might be the consequences if they don't? Think about that for a minute and then share with us, please.
I think we've got a lot of people thinking, Patty.
Good.
They don't know enough about science of reading. They're still learning too, or this person is talking about themselves. They're still learning. They may not understand of science of reading. They aren't well versed in that area. They may perceive that the teachers know more than they do, and they don't feel expert enough. They're not experienced. They want to leave it to the coaches.
We're going to talk about that.
Reading isn't their area. They wear so many hats. It's hard to specialize in their part of the pendulum shift, and they may not have fully feel like they've made the shift themselves. And if they don't, teachers are going to struggle without support. For sure.
Principals haven't taught reading. Yes, I've got it up now.
Okay.
Hold all over the place.
Yeah.
Yep. Consequence may be that student learning will be negatively impacted. So true. Yeah. So true. The leaders don't always get the training. Yep. We're going to talk about that too. Yep. Great responses. I'm really enjoying reading these. They know very little about SOR. They haven't been taught. Yep. Ineffective implementation. Yes. And somebody put about inequity, and that is so true if they don't. Okay. Well, let's get going on this. So as I said, we work in schools all across the country. And what you've said is what I find to be true. And what I also find is that a lot of it is they're intimidated because perhaps it's fear of a phoneme, or perhaps it's that bunting digraph, or maybe it's that nonsensical syntax. The truth is they are intimidated. Our principals have not been trained in the science of reading. And we're going to get into what that implication is, but also trained in other areas that align with the science of leadership. Unfortunately, one of the biggest, not unfortunately, it takes courage to be a leader, and we must do the things we think we cannot do. That picture on the left hung on in my principal wall, and it was given to me when I was a teacher from my mentor principal. And I used to face that and look at that every single day, because as a principal, I faced many things that I thought I could not do and knew that I had to. Well, the same is true of providing instructional feedback to our teachers as a principal. It takes courage, and even if we do have fear of a phoneme, what we're going to find out is that there's a lot of other things that we can be giving them feedback on that aligns with the science of reading. So let's dig into what some of those are. So I've underlined this list right here is from Hattie's effect size list. And you can see that teacher subject matter has an effect size of 0.11, which is actually quite small. So there are other things regarding instruction that have a much larger effect size. Scaffolding, as an example, has an effect size, as you can see, of 0.82, deliberate practice, 0.79, and direct and explicit instruction. Direct instruction has an effect size of 0.60, and explicit instruction has an effect size of 0.57. Now, of course, when we look at Hattie's research, we know that we're looking for something that has an effect size. Our big, powerful ones are over a 0.40. So we don't need to fear that phoneme, because there's a lot of things that we can be doing in our literacy classrooms and giving feedback to our coaches or to our teachers that actually have a much higher effect size and a much higher impact. Now, it's not that I don't want you to understand a phoneme and the science of reading. I do, but I don't want it to prevent you from giving excellent instructional feedback to our teachers. So in my book, you've got this. There's lots of things you can be doing instead. So let's take that intimidation away, because what we know from the science is that teachers need feedback. Now, this has been around for quite some time. In fact, it was the first bit of research that we relied on as far as how effective principals could be. And it's from Kenneth Leithwood. And Kenneth Leithwood was one of the first researchers on school leadership. And what we knew before the Wallace Foundation's research came out was that leadership is second only to classroom instruction among all school-related factors. But we didn't quite know what specifically they needed to be doing that made them effective. We knew that they had an impact, but we didn't know exactly what those things were. So when Kenneth Leithwood, and he started doing his research in the 1990s, actually late 1980s, not 1880s, but he started doing his research in the late 1980s. He was only able to analyze one school at a time. So he could only observe one principal per school. And he was unable to separate the performance of the principal from the performance of the school's typical performance. And further, he wasn't able to identify exactly what those principals were doing. But because we have put different practices into place and we have more data available, we can now see exactly, not exactly, there's still a bit of fuzziness to this research, but it sheds light on how schools might change under a particular principle and what that effect might be. So as you think about it and you think of the different pieces of legislation that have been acted, the different reforms that have been put into place, we now have databases, and this is just a tip of the iceberg, that of course nationally include how different states, different schools are doing on our state summative assessments. Our state summative assessments are much more similar than they used to be. We can now track ethnic disproportionality and school discipline practices. Those things have to be turned in. We can focus because of an adjustment or a change in our teacher evaluation system across the country. We can now focus on how much a leader is engaged, how often they're doing evaluations, and what the outcome of those evaluations are, and how those change over time with just one principal. And then we can track data on school choice options. Where are parents choosing to enroll their student, and for what reason? So you can see, just by having new information, that gives us much more insight into what principals are doing. So these advanced research methodologies allow us to compare the school's performance under a different principal. And all of this research, all of those different areas that we've just talked about, have been synthesized and put together by the Wallace Foundation, and so that we can now measure the size of a principal's effects on student outcomes. And we now know what it is that good principals do to effectuate change. So before we get into that, here's what I'd like to know. We have all known good principals and, unfortunately, bad principals, but there's both, just like teachers. But here's what I'd like to know. Let's see how close you come to the research. In your mind, what makes a quality principal? Share that with us in the chat box, please.
Well, Patty, they are saying a lot of different characteristics. They're a good communicator, a team player. Communication is really coming up. They are present. They're in the classroom. They're a risk taker, a good listener. They know the curriculum, data-minded, collaborative, passionate, trustworthy. Communication is a real strong theme. They don't knee-jerk.
I love that.
Yeah. Accountability. They're listening and reflective. Change maker. Willingness to be vulnerable. I bet that really resonates.
Love that.
Yeah. They stay focused on the mission, committed to building future leaders. They're able to model in the classroom and give effective feedback on instruction. They practice intellectual humility. How about that one?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Put personal differences aside. Really thoughtful responses.
Okay. Well, I have to tell you, there was a big one there, Jan. I missed it.
Okay.
Expert in de-implementation of what is not working.
You
And
got
that's
it.
from Gail. Hi, Gail. Yes, that is correct. De-implementation of those old practices that don't work.
Mhm.
A literacy leader. Yes. Balance between tight and loose. Nice. Excellent. You guys have figured out that I can do the chat box now.
Yeah, excellent. Go for it, girl.
Spend a majority of time in the school. You know, often principals are pulled out because of the district and they don't want them. I remember I hated that when I was a principal. So great. I want to talk about a couple of them because you're spot on with, of course, all of them. But visible. Visible is a big one. And visible does come up in the research, particularly when we talk about instructional feedback. And of course, communicate. And another one that you guys talked about is trust. Trust is one of the biggest issues with making sure that, in fact, they say the more trustworthy you are with your teachers, they will follow you anywhere. Data, all of those things are absolutely true. So let's dig into it and see what we can find out. So I love this. So as I said, we now have more information, and we used to know that the principal was the second biggest factor. But look at this, and we're going to be looking at these little tidbits as we go along today. Replacing a principal at the 25th percentile in effectiveness with one at the 75th. can increase annual student learning in reading and math by almost 3 months annually. And I don't know if you know it, but the typical growth in a school is about 7 months a year. It's not a full year. It's about 7 months. That's about how much growth a typical student makes in the school year. So imagine adding 3 months on to that. Holy cow. For you principals out there, you matter greatly. And in fact, I think that some of us, and I'm speaking as a principal, don't quite recognize on a daily basis what a difference we can be making. In fact, the impact of having an effective principal is nearly as large as the effect of having a similarly effective teacher. So with that in mind, I want us to think about the professional development that we're providing to teachers in this science of reading thing. It's what I've dedicated my professional life to since I think 1990 or 1991 is the research on reading. But here's what I see, and here's what concerns me a little bit. We're doing, departments of education across this country are doing a great job of providing professional development in the science of reading to teachers. In fact, we have a preponderance. Most states are now requiring that teachers, or a great deal of states are now requiring that teachers have knowledge in the science of reading. But get this, folks, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute. There's 4 states, currently about to be 5 states, that mandate principal or professional development to principals in the science of reading. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not even 5. We're getting close to that. Holy cow. So what we're doing, and somebody alluded to this earlier in the chat, is that teachers know more about the science of reading than the people who are supposed to be giving them feedback. Well, no wonder they're intimidated. That isn't okay. But there's more to it than that, unfortunately. Understanding how children learn to read, the science of reading, that research on how children learn to read, is simply akin to understanding how a rocket flies. Hear me out on this one. So if we understand how a rocket flies, what makes it stay up in the air, that was my speaker, we still have to learn how to build the rocket, or we won't get any rockets to fly. So even if we continue to move from 5 states to 47 states or 50 states in making sure principals know how children learn to read, that isn't enough, because we haven't given them the how to implement it. And that's what's critical if we want to raise reading achievement. So as I said, teachers are receiving a preponderance of PD in the why for shifting gears in literacy instruction, but only 5 states require that for school leaders. And as I said, even if we require that in every state in our nation, they still lack the knowledge of how to implement literacy blocks, data systems, and things like that. Often, when a teacher is trained in the science of reading, she goes back to a classroom full of balanced literacy materials, leveled text, a workshop model, and that's what that teacher is evaluated on. So that isn't okay. In fact, people are finally starting to recognize this. And I've put 2 articles that have just come out. Well, actually, why putting the science of reading into practice is so challenging. That came out in March of last year in Ed Week, and it focuses on the state of North Carolina and how they have implemented letters across the state to make sure that teachers know how to teach the science of reading. But that doesn't talk about how to implement that. And again, that doesn't teach the principal how to implement that. And then on February 4th, another article came out entitled, Teachers Need the Why, the What, and the How for How to Change to Happen. And that's out of Forbes. And I strongly suggest you take a look at that article too. Both of them talk excessively about we're giving teachers professional development, the why in the science of reading, but we still are not including how we implement it, what we need to use, and those sorts of things. And we certainly aren't providing that to our teachers. Oops. Okay, so what does this have to do with the science of reading? What is it that we need to know about the research on principles that'll help us, with the science of reading? Well, there are 4 big buckets in that large synthesis of research that we talked about before. You can see what they are there. Today, in this webinar, we're going to engage in that. We're going to focus on that top one, how we provide instructional feedback in a variety of ways to our principals. So when we talk about engaging in instructionally focused interactions with teachers, that's the big bucket. That is so clear that that's what we need. That's one of the things that principals need to do in order to increase outcomes for all students. There's really 3 layers to that. It's teacher observation and evaluation, feedback and coaching, and then establishing a data-driven instructional program. And we'll get into each one of those. Let's start with teacher observation and evaluation. So, numerous studies indicate that students benefit greatly from a sophisticated teacher evaluation system that marries good quality observation, classroom observation, coupled with good teacher feedback regarding that. In fact, those studies indicate that coupling of an evaluation system or observation with good quality feedback increases reading achievement gains from a standard of 0.1, a standard deviation of 0.10 to as high as a 0.27 standard deviation. So I love this quote from Charlotte Danielson. I'm going to give you just a second to read it on your own. So obviously, what she is saying here is that anyone who supports teachers, mentors teachers, must be able to identify what those good practices are and have, in this case, as we're talking about, they must be able to recognize good components of what literacy instruction is. And they must be able to have productive conversations with the person that they're evaluating or mentoring or providing feedback to enhance their practice. And not only that, the evaluators must be able to accurately assess how the teachers are doing, so that there is a feeling of legitimacy when teachers receive that feedback. So what does that require specifically? Well, what it requires is that principals make sure that they have a dialogue with their faculty regarding, okay, what is it that we think constitutes good literacy instruction, so that we can all be on the same page, so that when I'm in your classroom, we all know what it is that I will be looking for. So we need to have, as a faculty, a shared understanding of what good practice in literacy instruction is. But unfortunately, how often do we forget that dialogue? And that dialogue needs to occur within the first week or so of school. We need to all come together and say, what is it that constitutes good or that makes up good literacy instruction? And not only that, in order to do that, we need to establish a culture of continued learning, of professional inquiry as it relates to good literacy instruction. We don't just stop at what we know today. We keep growing and developing what our vision is of good literacy instruction. But there's a problem. And here's several of what the problems are. As I said, in less than 5 states, we require principals to demonstrate even a knowledge of the science of reading. So how can they have that conversation with their staff if they don't have a good understanding of the science of reading? Clearly, that creates a problem for the staff. Here's another problem. There is no state or educational institute and I'm talking about principal school here, that mandates that a principal knows anything about explicit and direct instruction. Yet we know that explicit and direct instruction is as part of the science of reading as the 5 components of literacy are. So they must also know what quality explicit instruction looks like. Oh, and yet there's one more problem. There are primarily 2 systems for teacher evaluation in our country, and one is based on a constructivist approach. And a constructivist approach is completely contrary to explicit and direct instruction. And in fact, not only is one of our major evaluation systems in our schools based on a constructivist approach, it is used in 31 states. Now, only 10 states in our country have to use the evaluation system that the state has adopted, so that does help a bit. But this constructivist approach, as I said, is in 31 states and over half of the country's 20 largest school districts. So you can see that we are evaluating teachers on a system that doesn't even align with how we need to be teaching reading. So what does make teacher evaluation effective? What makes teachers feel like what they are receiving is adequate? Well, as we talked about, the first one is legitimacy. Teachers know when they are being given the right feedback, and not only that, they value their evaluation system even more when it creates growth in their instructional practices, when they can see a change in their instructional practices from the evaluation that was provided to them. Teachers are also very sensitive, and this is from the research, that corresponds to true teacher effectiveness. If they think that they're a mediocre teacher, but they get an evaluation that says they're sensational, they know that that's not legitimate. And the more they feel that their evaluation is legitimate, the more likely they are to embrace it and enact on what the principal is asking them to do. Another thing that makes teachers value their evaluation system is when they see principals implementing professional development based on evidence from the evaluations they've conducted. In other words, if a teacher might not know how to teach explicitly, and in the spring, the principal ensures the staff is getting professional development in explicit instruction, then that teacher feels, oh, I wasn't the only one. We're now getting professional development and something that I desperately needed. There must be other teachers that are feeling the same way. So all of those make teachers value their evaluation even more. So let's align that thinking with the science of reading. So the first step for my principals out there is that you must know your evaluation system. And is your evaluation rubric or framework that you use based on a constructivist model of teaching? You have to go through it and find out if it's a constructivist model or if it's a direct instruction model. And then if it is a constructivist model, even in the teacher framework as an example of one of them that is based on a constructivist, there are areas that call out explicit instruction. So make sure you find those areas in your evaluation system that are calling out explicit instruction and highlight those. They're hard to find, but you can find them. Another question that you need to ask is, does your evaluation system contain any information related to the 5 components of reading? I know that the state of Colorado, when I was the executive director, did have that in their evaluation system. It doesn't anymore. So I do also know that the state of Utah is working on aligning their evaluation system to the science of reading. So again, check with your evaluation, look at your framework, and make sure that there is an alignment and see where you can find to make connections. Another area of concern in many teacher evaluation frameworks and rubrics are that some are literature-based and refer to a literature sort of classroom instead of a very specific literacy block that includes the 5 components, as we said, and an alignment, an instructional hierarchy, and things like that. So step 1 is know what your teacher evaluation system looks like. So more implications for teacher evaluation in the science of reading. As a principal or an evaluator, you must make sure that you understand the components of reading and how they change across the grade level. What we would see in 1st grade and 2nd grade is certainly not what we would want to see teachers doing in 4th and 5th grade. So how do those components of literacy differ over time? And that does require knowing quite a bit about the science of reading. It's also very important that as an evaluator, you understand explicit and systematic instruction. Again, those are such a key component to the science of reading, and they have huge implications for how a teacher is teaching her universal instruction and how they are providing interventions. In both of those arenas, we must be teaching explicitly. As we mentioned, it's important to understand the layout of a quality literacy block, and it's also very important to be able to dissect and analyze the literacy data that's coming from that classroom that you're evaluating. How are the students doing? What is their growth over the course of the year? And are you able to provide next steps to that teacher? So let's look at those so it isn't quite so daunting. The first one, understand a quality literacy block. Well, when we're thinking about a literacy block, we want to make sure that there's an instructional hierarchy of skills, beginning with phonemic awareness, moving on to phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and then comprehension. Each one of those helps the next part of the hierarchy. If I know what the sounds are, I can then do better understanding my letter sound correspondence at phonics. And then if I can decode words, I'm more likely to be able to decode those vocabulary words. And then I can practice all of those through fluency. And the more fluent I am, the better I can comprehend. So it's important that teachers have a logical layout in their literacy block. The next one is an alignment of skills. The more that we have an alignment of skills, the better the opportunity we have to practice. If I am learning CVC words of short A, and then I have the opportunity to read words in a decodable text that have short A, the more practice I have with those. Also, the length of time for each skill based on the grade levels. I just recently saw floating around the recommendation that we should be teaching, our literacy block needs to be 3 hours. Now, I will tell you, as a former principal, that that isn't necessary. We can get it done in a much shorter block of time than that. But we have to make sure that teachers are teaching it correctly and are teaching it adequately in each of the different sub-skills. And then, of course, what are the layout of the curriculum being used and the components? Are the teachers following a good scope and sequence where one skill builds upon the next? Are they teaching the critical components that we've just talked about? Now, here's another thing. If you have a good core program in your school, and I know that many of you do not have that luxury, but if you do you, the principals, have a login to the teacher resources so that you can see that they're following the scope and sequence and teaching all of the critical components? And is there a lesson plan template? And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So many of our big core reading programs that are out there have far too many things in them. And teachers end up picking and choosing what the most critical components are. And frankly, they don't always know. That comes back to the how do I implement this? And so we have found, and we create for our schools a lesson plan template that takes them through day by day what exactly it is that they need to be doing. And it's outlined, again, in that very logical instructional hierarchy. For principals and evaluators, this makes your job so incredibly easy. All you need to do is to find out from the teacher, what unit are you on and what lesson are you on? And you either go to the resource and log in to see if they are teaching the critical components, or you follow the lesson plan template based on what lesson they're teaching. So your job becomes so incredibly easy. It's all right there for you. So also, when you're observing in Tier 3, and I find principals so incredibly intimidated by evaluating special education because that's not their background. But there are many of the same principles when we evaluate Tier 3 instruction. As an example, are they teaching explicitly? So critical in a Tier 3. Are they providing an adequate amount of time for students to practice what it is they're learning? Remember, we talked about that high effect size of deliberate practice earlier in this presentation. What a huge effect size that has on our students. Are they using that appropriate scope and sequence? And are teachers teaching to fidelity? We have found that the most successful Tier 3 interventions are those with a scripted format to them. There's a very specific algorithm that gets kids to grade level. So are they using that as it's intended? And then what we see in many tier 3 situations is that we are skill driven, which we want to teach kids skills, but then we need to give them opportunity to have time and text. We have found that it's that time and text aligned with the skill we're teaching that makes such a huge difference for our students. Of course, we believe that to be time and decodables as they're first learning to read and those who are struggling. So in your chat, I believe, or someplace, there are lots and lots of decodables out there. And we will tell you, a lot of them aren't very good. We have gone through literally dozens of decodable text, and we've vetted them, and we just have a list here for you that you could use to find good decodable text. I'm going to stop there. Oh, you know what? I'm going to do one more slide, and then I'm going to stop there for just a minute, and we'll take some questions on evaluation and observations. So I'd like to summarize that little section of how we have instructionally focused engagement with our teachers. So regarding your evaluation and observations, know your evaluation system. Talk to your staff regarding what constitutes good literacy instruction. Focus on the curriculum if you have a good curriculum, and provide feedback on the layout of the literacy block, whether or not a teacher is teaching explicitly. Are there opportunities for students to practice the skill they're learning? Is there a proper scope and sequence? Provide actionable items when you're doing your evaluations to teachers that will make a difference. And then look at the trends that you're seeing in your observations and evaluations and align future professional development for your teachers to those trends you're seeing. So I'd like to stop there for just a second and see if we have any questions on evaluation and observation. And take a drink of water.
Patty, you did mention states that were constructivist or not constructivist, 5 states. People are asking if you can name names, which of those states have mandated. Well, the states you mentioned, 5 different states. There's some questions about that.
Well, you know, sometimes I can rattle that off the top of my head, and sometimes I can't.
Very good. That's
Utah is requiring it. Tennessee is requiring it. Colorado is about to step into that and requiring PD for principals. I think another one is Arkansas, and that's about as far as I can go. There's one more.
Well, that's fair. Thank you. Thank you for that.
And then, the constructivist you had brought up. You know, the constructivist evaluation, the teacher framework, is based on Charlotte Danielson's model. And there are good things in Charlotte Danielson's model, but it is based on a constructivist approach. Okay. And you have to dig through it to find the spots that speak to explicit instruction.
Okay, thank you. Danny is, I think, really enjoying what you're presenting today, and she's wondering about your book, The Principal's Primer. Does it expand on the kinds of things you're talking about here today?
You know, it does, but I would like to, Angie Hanlon, who is on here, I think in our audience, she and I are actually working on another book that will be published by Solution Tree. We're hoping that it will be coming out right about in December. right in the middle of writing it, and it's entitled It's Possible. So be watching for that book, and it will definitely go into all of these things that we're talking about today, very much so, in great depth.
Fantastic. Great. Angie's saying hi to you right now. So yes, she is here. Eric is asking about the decodables on your list, and really thank you for sharing that. Are there decodables on your list that are being used in her district? They're not recommended. I'd love to know if they are not. Okay, I'm not sure what Erica's question. She modified it. She's using decodables that are not on your list.
Yeah.
And if they're not recommended or haven't been vetted.
Yeah, if she can slip me the name somewhere. You guys, Jan, you'll know where she should, or maybe she can just, and I can look to see.
Okay.
I think we went through about 3 dozen. And we aligned them to a really good scope and sequence, and had some other criteria like that. So the ones that we have put on there are really by far what we feel are the best decodables out there. And we have some chapter books on there too for older students.
Oh,
so
nice.
Make sure you look at those as well.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I know there's a growing body, so it can be hard to keep up. So Steve has a question about the frequency of feedback. How often should principals be providing this type of feedback?
You know what? We're about to get into that. That comes under the next session. So let's go ahead and get started.
Perfect. All right.
We can. Okay. So the next big bucket under that, how do we have instructional engagement with teachers, is feedback and coaching. And that one gets interesting. In fact, Jan and I have had conversations about this regarding the role of principal feedback and coaching and all of that sort of thing. But principals can and should provide instructional feedback and coaching to teachers. So here, I've got something that I'd like you to think about. Many principals do not have instructional coaches. If we have a coach, we think, well, everybody's got a coach. But that's not true. We work in lots of rural schools, and it's upon the shoulders of the principal to provide feedback. So it becomes incumbent on the principal to provide feedback and coach teachers. That's the only way they grow. So how many of you have an instructional coach? And if yes, how many of you have seen an instructional coach in the classroom or in your school? If yes, what do you think that does to the role of the principal? Are they still instructional leaders? I'd like to know what you think.
A lot of yes so far, Patty.
Yeah, interesting. Marcia Case, nice to see you on here.
We have expectations in the district.
Nice. Are the principals, are instructional leaders? I saw that one, Taylor.
Let's see. Not dedicated to coaching. They end up having a ton of other responsibilities.
Coaching can land on the interventionists. Yes. Other responsibilities.
It's hard for some principals to do all the work without an instructional coach.
Yep. So true.
We have both. When feedback and next steps from both are aligned, powerful change happens.
Powerful. And that's key, when it's aligned. And if they're not on the same page, that can create lots of havoc. Oh, so true. Some principals try to model, but then they don't have. Oh, what a good point. How effective is this? Not very, Mary Love. Not very at all. Okay, well, I'm gonna be candid with something here. And you know, I loved every single one of my coaches. They were invaluable to me, but I wanted to be the instructional leader. And so I had a hard time with not being the instructional leader. And I find that for some principals, when they do have an instructional coach, they let it go to the teacher or to the coach. And what we find is that what we know from the research, as we've talked about all along, is that the most effective principals do have instructional engagement or engage in instructional conversations with their teachers. They need to be seen as an instructional leader. But things get in the way. And I also understand that. Principals, and many of you have alluded to this, there are time for other responsibilities gets in the way. That is so true. So conversations become brief and infrequent. Here's the other thing, folks. Principals are intimidated by giving feedback, so they tend to focus on the positive. Principals are nice people for the most part, and they have a difficult time focusing on areas of improvement. It's just hard for them. But what we know is that in higher performing schools, principals who follow up quickly and consistently with actionable feedback, good things that a teacher needs to do next, are much more successful. And I know someone asked the question about how frequent is that? I don't have a specific number for frequency, but we have seen, in fact, working with one district, when we just started working with them, the principal gave feedback once or twice. By the end of the year, typical feedback was given to teachers 8 or 10 times a year. And that district became much more successful. So the more frequent, the better, as long as it's genuine. But the truth is, principals have to be taught how to provide coaching unless they've been a coach themselves. But just a couple of little tips on how to do that. Of course, when you are providing coaching, and we're talking about how it aligns to the science of reading, stick to the instructional program that we're working on. So focus on reading. Now, I know that many teachers say, well, but you need to observe me in math too. Well, of course you do. And so if our focus is on reading though, and they want you to observe in math, then use some of those similar practices, engagement strategies, scaffolding, deliberate practice, all of those things that we know have a high effect size, you can also use as you're observing for math. So I can't emphasize this enough. School leaders must know how to provide feedback on that topic in the science of reading. So you must know what makes a rocket fly, or you must know how children learn to read, but you don't have to have fear of that phoneme. Instead, if you do have fear of a phoneme, look at those instructional practices. I have confessed many times that for years I got a diphthong and a digraph confused. So if I can do it, you can do it too. So focus on the components of teaching and instruction. Relieve yourself of that fear of a phoneme. So as we think about coaching, feedback, and evaluation, what I have found recently in my work with principals is that these three topics get confused. In fact, I was on with a superintendent the other day, and he said, well, evaluation is negative. And I thought that was such an interesting perspective. He said, well, teachers see it as negative. Well, I don't want teachers to see it as negative at all. But and that advent of instructional coaching has led some principals to believe that they shouldn't coach, that they should step back from coaching. But instructional feedback should be a part of a principal's responsibility. And we're going to talk about in just a minute why that is so true. For schools to improve, principals must coach and give feedback and evaluate. Let's just look at the definition of these three words. And that, I think, will clear it up for us. This just comes from my dictionary.com on my phone. But a coaching is a person who trains a teacher or a team of teachers or an athlete and prepares them for an examination or a lesson. A coach gives instruction or advice. Feedback is a reaction to something that you've witnessed. It could be evaluative. It's a response back to somebody. And then an evaluation is a system of appraising, but certainly it should not be negative. It needs to have growth factors in it. So here's what I'd like you to talk to me about. In schools where there is an instructional coach, and this is what my friend Jan Hasbrook and I have had conversations about, the belief is that teachers volunteer for coaching, and I believe that it's collegial. I remember my wonderful instructional coach, Donna Bright, coming into me and saying, Patty, we have about 3 or 4 teachers. And I would say, who are they? And she'd say, I'm not telling you. But it is collegial. Teachers need to be volunteering in order for it to be efficient. But I'd like to suggest, who is it that volunteers to be coached? Well, in my book, what I have seen is that it's typically the good teachers. Good teachers want to be even better teachers. So who isn't left? Who has to coach the teachers that don't volunteer? Who are those teachers? Talk to us in that chat box, please. Who isn't volunteering? So therefore needs coaching.
Yeah.
Sorry, Taylor, go ahead.
We have some teachers who are more eager to get coached, so which we hear often, but I am happy to say all our teachers get coached one way or the other.
Good.
We have teachers who are less open-minded.
Yep.
Burnt out teachers. Resistors. I like what I'm doing. I'm close to retirement.
Yep.
We have, some who don't have a growth mindset.
There is something about the district. That was an interesting one. Good. Those who don't volunteer for coaching are given the directive. Yep, part of the feedback. Yep. Sorry, Taylor, what?
I found here in our district, there is language in the contract around this. Not sure this supports positive processes.
Interesting. Okay, yeah, lots of interesting feedback. And the point is that it is the resistors. I mean, you're spot on this, folks. Those are the people who don't typically want coaching. And for a school to improve, everybody must be coached and get better. It's a continuous, our active teaching needs to be continually refined. So principals must provide feedback to teachers. But how do you do it so that it is heard? Well, first, again, we're focusing on the science of reading. And the research that backs this up says that you need to be knowledgeable in the content. So yikes, think back to 5 states are ensuring that principals are trained in the science of reading or know the science of reading. Yikes, you can see what a problem that would be. We have to be wise in our instruction. We need to know what the curriculum is that we're mandating teachers to use, or that we're asking them to use, what that is comprised of. Where are its holes? Are they doing it adequately? Are they using it adequately? We must ensure that we evaluators know good instructional practices like explicit instruction. And then we have to be able to know the data. How are our teachers doing? Not in a composite score of how many kids do they have at the lowest level and the middle level and the highest level, but what are those sub skills that we may not be teaching like we need to in order to progress our students? We need to be able to establish relationships. We talked about this earlier, but trust from a faculty to a principal is a key factor in listening to what a principal says. I've written two resources there that are two of my most favorite books. One of them is out of print, but Trust Matters, the second edition, is a great book. And then Collective Trust. Oh my gosh, one of the best books ever written for building principles. Unfortunately, it's out of print, but such a good book. And then teachers want a principal that's a problem solver. You don't have to solve the problem, but you need to solve the problem with them, engage in that action of problem solving. And I couldn't resist but put one of my favorite books up there, Jan Hasbrook, on student-centered coaching, that talks about the problem solving process. We need to be, evaluators need to be a part of that. So there are some key factors that ensure that feedback is getting heard. Here's some examples that go along with what we've just talked about, and we talked about this a little bit. When observing, log into the curriculum that's being used. Make sure you know how to access it and what lessons they should be on. Check the pacing guides if you have pacing guides. Make sure teachers' lessons are coherent with a lesson plan template. And if you don't have a lesson plan template, just what is the layout? How are they progressing as you're observing them? Observe for engaging strategies and provide feedback on whether or not students were engaged. Become familiar with the intervention being used. This is a shout out to my two principals in Quest Academy in Utah. They have gone in there and taught the intervention lessons. And some of you may be gulping, but it's a school of 800 kids. And they have found the time to do a lesson themselves so that they can give feedback to teachers on how they are using the intervention. Many curriculum or many core programs provide quick videos, both on interventions and on core programs on how to teach a portion of that. Make sure you look at those too, so you know what they are suggesting. Get in there with the teachers and be a part of those teacher-led instructional conversations so that you can add to them. And not only this, so you can learn from them. And then understand the components of explicit instruction. And explicit instruction, I can't tell you, is so critical in a structured literacy format. In fact, I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Teachers believe, particularly, this is so true, folks, if you're shifting from a balanced literacy world to a science of reading world, teachers think that they are teaching explicitly. However, in a balanced literacy platform or area, they've been living in a workshop model for 20 years. And that is as far removed from an explicit instruction format as you can get. As I've said, we go into lots and lots of classrooms, and when teachers have recently been trained in the science of reading through letters or whatever thing that it is, we see lots of activities going on in classrooms because the scenario is generally this. We're shifting from a balanced literacy reading workshop model to the science of reading. And because letters talks about explicit instruction, it doesn't tell you how to teach explicitly. We see those activities being delivered in a workshop model. Lots of activities going on. And that isn't what good explicit instruction is. So you must understand the difference between a literacy block in a structured literacy classroom and one in a balanced literacy classroom. A very, very different structure. And another thing that just breaks my heart is that many teachers, once they've been trained in this, go back and they don't have adequate materials to teach. But if we are getting if we are shifting and have new materials, particularly in interventions as an example, good intervention programs are scripted and use an explicit instruction format because the teacher isn't used to that. She changes the script and makes it less explicit. So those are some things that you can watch for regarding explicit instruction. We also have provided for you an observation sheet. This is not a checklist. We will talk about checklists here in just a minute, but this is for you to use on the various components of explicit instruction and look for evidence for those when you go into classrooms. Now, I suggest that you also make sure the teachers have this. Again, it's that common vision of what we're looking for in a literacy classroom. So you should share this. Teachers should know what each of these components are. And as I said, we've provided that for you. So another way to make sure that we're giving feedback and coaching is, of course, we need to make sure that we think about how we are saying it, because that makes all of the difference. And I will tell you another confession that I did as a principal. We talked earlier about it was uncomfortable for me to go to areas of communication or to go to areas of improvement. That's hard. So I wasn't as kind as I probably sounded because it was difficult to get it out. But if you listen, pause and think before responding, ask questions earnestly, and be totally curious and be non-judgmental. All of those basic principles of communication make feedback so much easier and palatable for teachers to take. And of course, there are two big drivers to consider. Make sure, we've talked about this, that you stay focused, that you keep, as you're implementing this science of reading implementation, that you keep that the focus. And the other thing that you do is you keep focused on the student data from within the classroom, much less judgmental when you lay out what the facts are. And other ways, focus on our students engaged. Is small group instruction aligned to the students' data? Are they getting what they need in small group based on the data? And this one, oh my gosh, this one I know seems so simple, but are students reading? I spent 3 days in classrooms on the western slope of Colorado last week, and it was specifically during small group instruction. That's what I was looking for. And I didn't see students reading. I saw them on computers, I saw them on skill-based activities, but I saw very few students reading. And guess what makes students better readers? Reading. Another thing to look at are, how can teachers' data be strengthened? Are there areas of their foundational reading assessment that can be the various sub-skills? Maybe it's letter naming, maybe it's phoneme seg, maybe it's accuracy, where you can see a trend in the teacher's data and speak to that when you're giving feedback. With that said, do they need enhancement in one particular area of reading? As you are observing, this is a shout out to Davis School District in Utah. One of my wonderful principals there said, "Oh my gosh, Patty, I was observing and I couldn't remember if it was a blend or a digraph. So I quickly Googled it on my phone." She said, "I knew that she wasn't saying it correctly." So again, do not be afraid of a phoneme. You can Google much of that information. Okay, with that in mind, I'd like to ask you a question. How might the instructional feedback from principals look different from the feedback that a coach gives? What sort of difference might that make to the teacher? Type in the chat box, please.
Might be perceived as evaluative.
Mm-hmm.
And then coaches are typically not evaluative.
Yep.
Sometimes maybe it could be perceived as disciplinary.
Mm.
Coaching feedback may sound more reflecting and pose questions for the teacher to look deeper into their lessons and instruction. So the coach, well, we have coach does his job. The principal shows, I just lost that one. Principal shows that he cares.
Oh, what, Taylor, can you, it said something about coaches give specific feedback and principals do something else. Can you find that one?
Yes. Okay, coaches give specific instructional feedback, whereas principal feedback may be more general.
Oh, okay. Okay.
We have one, may communicate school-wide urgency to align practices.
Oh, love that. Love that. Spot on.
We have from coaches. Oh, go ahead.
Nothing. I saw one from Adrian Foster. Hi, Adrian.
We have from coaches, it's conversational. It's growth and process intended. It's based on relationship and trust.
Mm.
Someone thinks they see them as the same.
Can you go back up there? I just saw one from a principal, and it said that he needed to be very specific. Do you see that one? That's okay. That's okay. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So yes, here's what I see. Coaches do sometimes have a better relationship with teachers because we've talked about principals' plates are full. They don't have time for that stuff. And here's another thing that I see. And again, Jan and I have had conversations about this, but I want to talk about the coaching cycle, because when we are evaluating and providing feedback and coaching to our teachers that need more immediate feedback and coaching, and it's coming from the principal, you don't have time for a coaching cycle. And so you get to be more directive. That doesn't mean it's not constructive, and that doesn't mean that it's negative. But again, you don't have time for a lengthy coaching cycle. So what do we do instead? Here's an example of what I like to see. It's a teacher feedback protocol. This is, it's for 3 weeks. So you can see up in the right that exactly what the teacher or what the principal is looking at. 53% of the students are at benchmark on nonsense word. We don't think that's enough. We want to make sure that 80% of students are getting there based on progress monitoring data. The principal outlines very specific action steps, which does align with the instructional coach, and telling them that they will work together, and very specific steps as to what they need to do. So instead of a coaching cycle, principals can give a much more immediate feedback and much more immediate actionable next steps than the lengthiness of a coaching cycle. Here's an email I want you to ponder. This is from a true principal. So I'd like you to look for two things. What do you think? Read over this email and see what you think. Let me just add one more thing to this. This is to a teacher who they had asked to follow the scope and sequence very kindly for 4 times they'd been in there, and the teacher was not following the scope and sequence of the core program. So type in the chat box, what do you think of sending an email like that?
There's an assumption if you're not following, the teacher might be reviewing sounds students still struggling with.
Yep.
Also, context is important here. I think this is good because it allows the teacher an opening to explain. Makes me wonder about the teacher's mindset. Why are they not following the scope and sequence? This conversation, or the message is fine, but it needs to be face-to-face. A response needs to be required.
Yep.
I like it affirms conversation. Others think face-to-face.
And so let me give you even a little more context. As I said, the principal had been in there 4 times, had asked the teacher to follow the scope and sequence. And the teacher was really avoiding the principal. And one of you alluded to this. The principal wanted her to come in and discuss it and asked several times. So again, gave another opening and wanted to see some immediate turnaround. So I think it's interesting. And I'm wondering how many of my principals out there feel like they can give a very specific email like this. I know where you were in the scope and sequence. Here's what you should have been doing. Here's a decodable that would go along with it. So just food for thought. Okay. So here's a little bit of research to back up what we've been talking about. So time spent on coaching teachers by principals is associated with higher growth. But that time spent on just those being visible and poking your head in is not productive and doesn't increase overall achievement. Such an interesting little piece of data that is. Okay, we're going into our final section, and that's on how to use data to drive instructional improvement and using that data for, again, to have instructionally focused conversations. One of the things that the research indicates is that principals not only use data to make good decisions, but they also use data to inspire action. And I want you to answer this question, but it's specific to if you are out there and you're moving to a more science of reading approach, how might you use data to inspire action from your teachers? Type that in the chat box, please.
I think we have a lot of thinking up here. It is difficult to argue with data.
Nice.
The data helps create and establish a sense of urgency. Graphs tell the story. Use data to determine the types of skills groups and interventions needed. Seeing the growth and what we are doing is working. Data helps with next steps.
Yep. Nice. Yes. So I think one of the best ways to inspire, to use data to inspire action, particularly if you're going from a balanced literacy to a science of reading atmosphere or format, is to say, hey, 50% of our kids aren't reading on grade level. We must be doing something different. And then as you start this initiative, someone said this in the chat, to keep them apprised of, okay, are we getting better? How are we doing? And then don't forget that school leaders, you can use data to plan for human resources and a way to communicate that. What do I mean? I mean, if you have a second grade teacher that at the beginning of the year has 50% of her kids in intensive, but 2 other second grade teachers have 20%, is it fair to that second grade teacher that has 50% that she gets the same amount of paraprofessional time? Absolutely not. And we need to be looking at our data to make changes in how we allocate our resources. But too often, teachers all get the same amount of paraprofessional time. Another way that good principals use data is that we need to be creating goals, and not goals that say 86% of our kids will be at grade level, and we keep that goal year after year after year. No, we need to have very specific goals for each grade level. That is not only how many students will move to proficient, but also how many students will we get out of the lowest tier of instruction. And we need to progress monitor those goals along with the teachers. So if we said that at the end of the year, second grade will be at 70% proficient, and we started at 50% proficient, then by the middle of the year, we need to be to 60% proficient. And discuss with teachers how their students are doing towards that goal. What are the changes? Do we need to shift human resources so that we can get to that goal at the middle of the year? And another big one regarding data-driven instructional focus is this. So many of us have professional learning communities. And the 4 questions that we use in professional learning communities are correct. What do we want all students to know and be able to do? How will we know if they learn it? How will we respond when some don't? And how will we extend those learnings for those already proficient? Those are the absolute right questions, but I'm posing this question to you in the science of reading world. In grades K through 3, we might be looking for evidence in the wrong spot. And as an aside, most educational schools for leadership discuss the use of PLCs, but none of them discuss how principals should implement it. So I want you to think of a re-examination of those 4 PLC questions. Again, they are correct, but schools have been misguided in their understanding of those 4 PLC questions, because generally schools look at those as in relation to how students are achieving on the standards. And I believe in standards with all of my heart and soul, but standards don't measure whether a student is adequately learning to read. And if a student can't read at grade level, then we shouldn't expect them to adequately access grade level standards. So let's re-examine those PLC questions. What do we want all students to know and be able to do? Our primary answer should be to read at grade level. And so that means that when we are in our PLCs, we need to examine our interim assessments that measure the foundational skills of reading, not our standards. And then we need to have ongoing progress monitoring built into our system for any student who is reading below grade level. That should be the primary answer to what do we want all students to be able to know. And then how will we know if they've learned it? By ongoing progress monitoring of every single student who is below grade level. And we need to be monitoring those sub-skills found within that foundational reading assessment. And here's another thing, principals, you need to be attending all PLCs that analyze progress monitoring data in the foundational skills so that you can make sure that teachers are using strategies that effectuate change in the classroom. You must be there. So another re-examination of that PLC question, how will we respond when some students do not learn? Well, number one, by creating a culture of all means all, but also ensuring our teachers understand quality tier 2 instruction in the general classroom and implementing a rigorous tier 3 system. And those PLCs should include conversations that talk about the instructional strategies or the instructional action steps we will take next if any student cannot read. And the last one, re-examining the PLC questions, how will we extend our learning for those students who are already proficient readers? Well, we will build in intervention systems to extend students' learning when there is an intervention time. We need to make sure that we regularly progress monitor students who are at grade level 2, and not just by looking at the composite score, but by examining those foundational reading assessments so we make sure that kids are at grade level in all of those sub-skills. So we're going to wrap up. So just some thoughts, make sure that literacy is based on evidence. Principals should have instructional interaction in order to ensure that literacy is based on evidence. Make sure that you principals have instructional interactions with staff. And those instructional interactions include evaluations, observation, feedback, and data analysis. And each of those should be aligned with your focus of the science of reading and the foundational literacy skills. Some other tips: don't agonize over a phoneme. Focus on how teachers are teaching content versus craft. We know that the craft is a lot more important. Understand the data, know your evaluation system, and grow your knowledge in the science of reading. We recommend over and over for our principals, top 10 tools for teachers. You can take it on your own time. You can, too often we hear teachers feel intimidated by letters. You won't by top 10 tools for teachers. And look at this. The importance of principals providing feedback continues. For a school as a whole, the effectiveness of the principal is more important than the effectiveness of a single teacher. Holy cow. Well, that's because principals affect all 483 students, which is the typical population in a school building. And each teacher only affects 21 students. So the PD that we spend on principals, I can't underestimate that. And look at this one. Oh my gosh. The reading gains from replacing a below average principal with an above average one. Can you imagine this? Larger than approximately 50% of the effects on reading achievement on various educational interventions in 747 studies. It's demonstrated time and time again. And again, I so agree with this. It's hard to envision an investment worth more than the potential of growing our principles, yet we are requiring teachers to know about the science of reading, and a very limited amount of states are requiring it for principals. Here's what our own research says after working with thousands of schools or hundreds of schools every year, and we interface with thousands of principals. We know that those principals who provide highly effective instructional feedback to their teachers are far more successful. Those principals who observe in classrooms in a meaningful way, not just by poking in my head and waving, have much higher outcomes. And those who develop PLCs that focus on the foundational skills in kindergarten through second grade, instead of the standards, achieve results faster. And then this one, when a principal demonstrates that they are the instructional leader, they have a staff that will follow them anywhere. And right now I'm talking to you, district leaders and heads of departments. Work on policies. This can't be all me. I can't do all this dirty work. Make sure that policies promote professional development to school leaders in the science of reading. And also, please make sure that your evaluation systems link to the 5 components of reading. Work with principal schools to update their offerings. We are woefully far behind in what principals learn in principal school. And then provide leadership coaching and mentoring to your principals. That also is, research indicates that when they have a principal or mentor and coach for principals, we have increased literacy outcomes. It's what Schools Cube does. And we've come to the end. Does anyone have any questions?
Patty, we have some questions. How much time do you feel is needed for a literacy block if good quality explicit instruction is in place?
120 minutes. I mean, you can do it in 90, but that's hard. 120 minutes will get the job done.
And how does the hidden curriculum approach help in the science of reading?
How does what? I'm sorry, I didn't.
I wonder if the hidden curriculum approach?
No, I don't understand that term.
No. Well, we did also have some questions about the structured literacy classroom and kind of what that looks like and where to begin finding information regarding the structured literacy classroom.
Yeah, well, as I said, there's a great new book coming out that'll tell you all about that. But you don't take letters, top 10 tools, and as we said, that doesn't give you how to implement it. You know, you can reach out to us, and I'm happy to supply you with a lesson plan template so that will outline what a block looks like.
Do progress monitoring tools need to be shared across the building and district? We have someone who says this seems to be a gap.
I'm not under. You read that one again, Taylor?
Do progress monitoring tools need to be shared across the building and district?
Oh, whomever asked that, if you could give us a little more information. Your school should have a common progress monitoring tool that aligns to your benchmark and screener.
Right. And we've had a couple ask about schedules, and someone said, any advice for principals for designing schedules to meet Tier 1 as well as interventions for Tier 2 and 3?
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's one of my favorite topics, believe it or not. Yes, a staggered schedule so that you can, so what I mean by that is each grade level starts about 30 minutes after the last one. This allows for a more push-in effect. This allows for a spread out of interventions throughout the day. I don't recommend starting in kindergarten. Because we have hats and mittens and tying shoes to worry about the first 30 minutes. So I suggest starting with first grade, then bringing in kindergarten, second, third, fourth, and fifth, but changing for the upper grades from year to year so that fifth grade or sixth grade isn't always getting literacy at the end, and discussing that and building a good schedule with your teachers.
Hey, Patty, this is Jan. I'm going to jump in here because we have quite a few parents attending these sessions. And Tina is asking, I think, a really good question. How do I know if my children's principal is average or otherwise?
Good, really good question. And you know what, parents, I'm going to also, so I'm going to answer that, but I'm also going to refer you to our dyslexic association here in Colorado, CoKid, and they have a resource that I wrote in conjunction with them that says, what do I look for in my school? Taylor was a part of that as well. And that is a resource that outlines what my school should be doing so that we are addressing and ensuring that we're teaching literacy correct. Oh, thank you. That is it right there. It's called the Literacy Dialogue Tool, and people in our state have found it to be very helpful.
And they just added it to the chat.
Nice. Nice. Hi, Colorado. Hi, CoKids.
You have something at this point to talk about schedules and structures specifically. It's a barrier that some are facing.
Yeah, well, we talked about making sure you have a staggered schedule so that you can utilize your human resources across the day. Another thing, you know, we could do a whole webinar on collaboration and how you get your teachers involved. But that is something that I really recommend that we collaborate on building that good schedule. Here is what I will tell you. Teachers should not be telling the principal when they will be teaching literacy. That is a school-wide decision that needs to be made.
Yeah. And I have a question. I'm just going to ask you directly this, Patty, because I'm hearing a lot of questions about people grappling with, as we all are, with this growing, evolving body of evidence, the science of reading. What about small group versus whole class? A lot of people are interpreting the work of Natalie Wexler and her interest and others in knowledge-based curriculum. And she's really pushing doing knowledge-based curriculum whole class and moving away from small group. But there's a lot of evidence about the value of small group instruction for targeting skill development of students. What have you seen in your work?
Yeah, so we have seen that model, and I will be perfectly frank. When we don't do differentiated instruction in small group based on data, we are missing another opportunity to grow students. So I strongly recommend that we must have both whole group, where we do use that strong knowledge base and teach that strong knowledge base, but we also have to have whole group too, because all kids aren't on the same level, and kids have gaps, and it's one of the best ways, small group instruction, to close those gaps for students, and we see it very, very effective, very effective.
Well, thank you, Patty. That was my understanding, both of the research. And I understand the point of a good, rich, knowledge-based curriculum, and I want to see more of that implemented in schools, but not to stop doing small group instruction based on need, both for the students who are struggling. And I know I've been doing a lot of work over the last few months, many months, with Nancy Young, who is the developer of that wonderful infographic, The Ladder of Reading. And she's a strong advocate for the kids at the top of that group, those kids in the who are proficient, prolific readers who come to school already reading. We need to be attentive to those students' needs as well.
Absolutely, we do. Our students need to be, our students that are a grade level, we need to ensure that they're growing as well. And so a small group is another great opportunity for them.
Thank you. Thank you for this. There's lots of questions about data. That is definitely, I'm going to just tell everybody, that's one of the things we have on our to-do list for Read Washington is to bring in someone to talk about data. You're getting, I hope you can see the chat, Patty, because you're getting accolades from everybody. Wonderful, wonderful. This is inspiring. And we're so grateful that we will be able to share the link, and people get the link and they can share it with anybody they want to, because people are saying, my principal needs to hear this. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. You can share it with your principals, and we're going to work. Yeah, Amy just put in the chat, we're going to work to get that link out as quickly as possible. I think you've answered generally. There are people asking very specific questions about what curriculum do you recommend or not recommend. And I think that's those are more specific to people's individual needs. So I think we're probably about ready to wrap this up. If you want to stop sharing, because I have
sorry.
On behalf, no, that's all right. That was a great thing to put in there. Just another reminder for everybody attending today and watching the recording is that we do have upcoming webinars, and the next one on our list is, if I can get my slide to advance here. So you can save the date. Read Washington will be sponsoring our next event on Saturday, May 20th. Joan Sedita, who's just written a wonderful book called The Writing Rope, and she's going to share her immense knowledge and wisdom about the science of reading instruction on that day. So we do want to thank you for attending. Taylor and Patty, thank you so much for taking this time and sharing your knowledge with us. You've really inspired a whole lot of people. This is fantastic. And thank you all for attending today and watching the recording afterwards. We're in this together, right? We're all here because we care so deeply about preventing the unnecessary pain of reading failure. Together, we can achieve that. Thank you all very much. Stay connected with us at Read Washington, and thank you for all the hard work that you're doing.
Thank you for having us. And thank you everyone for attending.